Extraction 2 opens on a brutal image. Tyler Rake lies barely conscious on a stretch of sand along the outskirts of Dhaka. His body is wrecked, marked by deep injuries from the mission he somehow survived. Blood seeps into the shoreline beneath him as a few locals gather, stunned by the sight. Realizing he's still alive, they scramble to call for help. Within minutes, a medical evacuation helicopter cuts through the air and lands nearby. Tyler is rushed aboard and flown out, eventually arriving at a hospital in Dubai. Doctors waste no time. He's wheeled straight into intensive care, where machines take over the fight his body can't handle alone. Not long after, Nick Khan, his trusted ally and handler, arrives. The concern on her face says everything. She stays by his side constantly, watching over him day and night, refusing to leave. Days stretch into weeks, and Tyler shows no real improvement. The situation begins to feel hopeless. Yaz Khan eventually voices what no one wants to say. Seeing Tyler stuck in this fragile state, he quietly suggests that maybe it's time to let go, to switch off the machines and allow him peace. But Nick won't hear it. She shuts the idea down immediately. She's not ready to lose him. And then, against all expectations, something changes. A nurse notices subtle movement, faint breathing, a whisper. She calls Nick in a hurry. Tyler's eyes slowly open. His voice is weak, strained, but alive. His first words, rough and blunt, "F off," catch Nick completely off guard, and she can't help but laugh. It's the first real sign that he's still in there. From that moment on, the long road back begins. Recovery isn't easy. Tyler is pushed through intense physical therapy, painful exercises, exhausting drills, step-by-step rebuilding strength he nearly lost forever. Progress is slow but steady. Nick remains right there through it all, encouraging him, grounding him, making sure he doesn't give up. While Tyler fights his way back, trouble is already brewing elsewhere. In Georgia, Zorab learns that his brother's prison sentence has been extended. The news fuels his anger, turning frustration into something far more dangerous. Back in Dubai, Tyler isn't just healing physically, he's battling everything he's been carrying inside. The weight of his past decisions lingers. In a rare moment of openness, he speaks honestly with Nick, sharing the guilt that still haunts him. She listens without judgment, reminding him that what he did, saving Ovi, mattered. That it wasn't meaningless. Meanwhile, Zorab wastes no time. He reaches out to a government official, demanding intervention for his imprisoned brother, David, but the response isn't what he wants. The official explains that David's actions, killing a DEA agent, have drawn direct attention from the United States, making any political help impossible. That answer seals the man's fate. Zorab reacts instantly, eliminating the governor and his men without hesitation. Elsewhere, Tyler is finally discharged. Alongside Nick and Yaz, he leaves the hospital behind. There's a brief moment of lightness. Tyler jokes about Yaz's shirt, teasing him, which leads to Yaz promising to get him one just like it. From there, they head toward Austria. Nick takes Tyler to a quiet, remote cabin, her idea of a retirement gift, a place far removed from chaos. She encourages him to leave that life behind and start over, to build something different. For the first time in a long while, Tyler has a chance at peace. A few days later, Yaz keeps his word. The promised shirt arrives, but peace doesn't last long. Inside prison, David forces his family into his world. He insists they stay with him behind bars. When his wife resists, he lashes out, threatening to separate her from their children if she doesn't comply. Not far away, Tyler's attempt at a quiet life is interrupted. Returning home one day, he notices someone sitting casually on his porch, sipping tea like he belongs there. The stranger immediately recognizes Tyler, calls him the man who survived Mumbai, the one who pulled off the impossible. He offers Tyler a job. Tyler declines without hesitation. He's done with that life, but the man doesn't back off. Instead, he provokes him, suggesting Tyler no longer has what it takes, that he's lost his edge. Tyler responds without a word. In a split second, he fires, knocking the teacup clean out of the man's hand, a clear message. Still, the stranger presses on. Then he drops something unexpected. The job comes from Tyler's ex-wife, Mia. That changes everything. Now interested, Tyler invites him inside. The man explains the situation. Mia's sister, who happens to be David's wife, is trapped inside a dangerous Georgian prison because of her husband's actions. He goes on to describe David and Zorab's past. They grew up surrounded by conflict during Georgia's civil unrest, eventually identifying themselves as part of the Nagazi, a name tied to power and legacy. After fleeing to Armenia, they were raised under the influence of their uncle, Avtandil, who still controls much of their operation. When they returned to Georgia, they didn't come back weak, they came back dominant. Their network expanded into something resembling a powerful, almost untouchable organization. Their influence runs deep. David's imprisonment, that's not weakness, it's politics. After hearing everything, Tyler agrees to take the job. But there are rules. The prison is volatile, multiple factions inside, all ready to turn on him if anything goes wrong. If David finds out his wife is being taken out, he won't hesitate to have her killed. The stakes couldn't be higher. The man leaves, promising to reconnect soon. Meanwhile, Nick is enjoying a rare moment of peace on the breathtaking Amalfi Coast in Italy when her phone rings. It's Tyler. Retirement didn't last. There's a mission, and he needs her. Without hesitation, she agrees. Yaz joins in too. The team is back. Tyler throws himself into preparation. The recovery phase is over. Now it's about rebuilding strength, sharpening instincts. He removes his medical support, pushes his body harder, and returns to peak condition. Before long, they're on the move again. Their destination, Takiri Prison. Once there, they establish contact with a guard connected to room 207, the location where the target family is being held. Yaz stays positioned outside, acting as lookout, while Tyler moves in alone. Inside, the guard cuts the lights and quietly unlocks the gate. Then he gives Tyler a strict window. 5 minutes, that's all he has to get in and get out. Moving carefully through the shadowy hallways, Tyler Rake advances with only a faint beam of light guiding his path. Every step is measured, every sound controlled. He eventually reaches the cell where the family is being held. Inside, Ketavan is already awake. She somehow knew help would come. Gently, she wakes her children, whispering reassurance. Her son, Sandro, hesitates, but she calms him, promising that his father will follow soon. They begin moving out quietly, but just as they slip into the corridor, something goes wrong. The youngest child, Nina, accidentally drops her toy. It hits the ground with a sharp, unmistakable sound. Tyler reacts instantly, trying to crush it under his boot to silence it, but he's just a moment too late. That single noise echoes through the prison. Inside his cell, David snaps awake. Without hesitation, he lets out a piercing whistle, a signal. Within seconds, the entire block erupts into chaos. Prisoners loyal to him rise up, and the situation spirals into a full-blown riot. Now exposed, Tyler wastes no time. He pushes the family forward, guiding them through twisting corridors and down narrow stairwells as the prison descends into violence. Screams, footsteps, and metal clanging fill the air as danger closes in from every direction. At one point, they're forced into a cell with no immediate exit, only to find themselves surrounded by aggressive inmates. The tension explodes into a brutal clash. Tyler fights with relentless precision, holding off multiple attackers at once. The pressure builds until he's forced to fire a shot, dropping one of them to create space. It's enough to make the others hesitate. He quickly plants a small charge on the door. The blast rips it open just as the crowd surges again, giving them a narrow window to escape. They keep moving. Amid the chaos, Tyler leads them into a lower-level corridor, darker, quieter, but no less dangerous. Spotting a narrow opening above, a chute, he makes a quick decision. One by one, he lifts the children up, sending them through, instructing them to find Nick Khan waiting outside. But before Tyler and Ketavan can follow, David appears. He launches himself at them without warning. What follows is a raw, unforgiving fight. Tyler meets him head-on. The two clash in a tight, violent struggle. Tyler gains the upper hand, forcing David against a burning furnace, pressing him into it. The heat scorches him. Then, with a sharp movement, Tyler breaks his arm, ending his resistance. The fight concludes decisively. Ketavan steps in as well, delivering her own strike, years of anger and pain released in a single blow. But there's no time to process it. From the far end of the corridor, a wave of prisoners surges toward them. Tyler quickly radios Nick, ordering her to get the kids out immediately. Then he turns back, scanning for another exit. Outside, the prison has become a battlefield. Rioting inmates clash with armed police, turning the entire yard into chaos. Tyler and Ketavan push forward into the open, forced to fight their way through. At first, Tyler keeps the attackers at bay using his weapon, but his ammo runs dry. With no other choice, he shifts into close combat. The fight intensifies. Blow after blow, Tyler takes hits as he keeps moving. Ketavan refuses to stand back. She grabs a shovel and fights alongside him, doing everything she can to help. But the numbers are overwhelming. She's eventually knocked down, and several prisoners close in on her. Tyler reacts instantly. He tears through multiple attackers, forcing them back. When things reach a breaking point, he shields her with his own body and throws a grenade. The explosion scatters the crowd, creating a brief opening. But Tyler takes a hit to the head in the process, leaving him momentarily disoriented. That's all it takes. One of the inmates grabs Ketavan and drags her away. Tyler shakes it off quickly, regaining focus. He charges forward, cutting through anyone in his way. Along the route, he encounters police officers, disarms them, taking their shields to protect himself as fires begin spreading through the area. Step by step, he pushes through the chaos. Finally, he catches up. Without hesitation, he eliminates the man threatening Ketavan and pulls her free. At that exact moment, a powerful explosion rips through a nearby wall. It's Nick. Her team has arrived. Yazkan informs them they've intercepted enemy communications. The Nagazi are already closing in. There's no time to waste. They rush into armored vans waiting outside. With a final blast, the front gate is destroyed, clearing their path. The convoy speeds out of the prison grounds. Inside the vehicle, Tyler quickly instructs the kids to put on protective vests and stay low beneath the seats. But the escape doesn't last long. Up ahead, enemy vehicles. Nagazi fighters open fire, turning the escape into a high-speed pursuit. Nick and her team return fire, forcing several vehicles off the road. Still, the pressure keeps building. To shake them, Tyler veers off the main road, driving straight into a dense forest. The chase continues. Motorcycles weave through the trees, cars push forward aggressively, and grenades are thrown toward the vans. Explosions rock the surroundings, but Tyler and Nick manage to hold their ground, taking out several of the bikers with precise maneuvers. Then, a blast hits Tyler's vehicle directly. The van flips violently. Everything turns upside down. The team scrambles out of the wreck as gunfire rains down. The mercenaries lay down cover fire, creating space for the family to move. In the chaos, Nina injures her hand, but they don't stop. They run. Ahead, an industrial facility offers temporary shelter. They rush inside, sprinting through corridors and machinery, heading toward their next escape point, a train waiting to depart. They make it just in time. The train begins to move, pulling them away from immediate danger. But the threat isn't over. Soon, enemy helicopters appear overhead, closing in fast. Tyler searches the train and quickly finds a mounted machine gun. Without hesitation, he opens fire, hitting one of the helicopters. It spirals out of control and crashes into the snowy terrain below. One down, Tyler climbs onto the roof of the moving train, bracing himself against the wind as he prepares to take on the second helicopter. It fires back, forcing him to duck and move carefully to avoid being hit. Then, another problem. Several Nagazi fighters leap onto the train itself. Inside, Nick faces 3 of them at once. The fight is relentless, gunfire mixed with close combat. She manages to take them all down, even throwing one off the speeding train, but not without taking damage herself. Elsewhere, more attackers push toward the family. Tyler intercepts them before they can get close. Another brutal fight unfolds. At one point, a soldier nearly forces Tyler off the train, but he digs in, pushing back with everything he has. From inside, Sandra watches it all unfold, stunned as Tyler takes down each threat one by one. Once the immediate danger is cleared, Tyler rushes to Nick. She's hurt, but alive. And just as things begin to settle, the remaining helicopter circles back. The fight isn't over yet. Grabbing a heavy weapon from one of the downed attackers, Tyler Rake climbs back onto the roof of the speeding train. With steady aim, he tracks the helicopter circling above and opens fire. The rounds connect, sparks, smoke, and within seconds, the aircraft loses control, spiraling downward before erupting in a fiery crash against the snow-covered terrain. For a brief moment, it feels like they've gained the upper hand, but that relief doesn't last. Inside the train, Nick Khan quickly realizes something is wrong. The earlier gunfire has damaged the braking system. The train is now unstoppable. Tyler rushes back inside, urgency written all over him. He gathers the family, telling them to brace for impact. There's no slowing down now. The train barrels forward until inevitably it derails, metal screeching, carriages twisting as everything crashes violently off the tracks. At the same time, elsewhere, Zorab and Aftandil receive devastating news. David is dead. As they move toward their escape aircraft, the loss ignites something darker. This isn't over for them, not even close. Back with the survivors, the emotional fallout begins to surface. Sandro confronts Tyler, now fully aware of what happened. He knows Tyler is the one responsible for his father's death. Tyler doesn't dodge it. He explains calmly it wasn't personal. It came down to a choice, his mother's life or his father's. But that explanation doesn't ease the pain. Sandro's anger lingers. Later, aboard a plane headed toward Vienna, the tension quietly builds. Sandro overhears Tyler speaking about their destination. Seizing a moment when no one is watching, he takes Tyler's phone and makes a call. To Zorab, he asks the question that's been haunting him: was his father really going to harm his own family? The answer shifts everything. Zorab realizes the truth. His brother's wife was at the center of it all. Rage takes hold. He swears retaliation, not just against Tyler, but everyone involved. After the call, Zorab gathers his men, fueling them with a single purpose: revenge. Meanwhile, the team lands in Austria and moves into a secure, safe house. For the first time since the chaos, there's a chance to pause. Nick sits down with Ketavan, a conversation layered with shared history and understanding, especially given her connection to Tyler's past. But peace doesn't hold. Sandro approaches Tyler again, still struggling to process everything. His anger surfaces once more. Tyler stays composed, explaining that there was no personal hatred, only necessity. They think they're safe. They're wrong. As Tyler tries to connect with Sandro, the boy suddenly notices something, movement, danger approaching. Before anyone can react, the sound of rotors fills the air. A helicopter appears overhead. At the same time, vehicles flood the area, Nagazi forces closing in fast. Tyler reacts instantly, shouting for everyone to move. Inside, Ketavan discovers the truth. Sandro has been secretly communicating with Zorob, arranging a meeting. The boy insists the Nagazi are his family. There's no time to argue. Gunfire erupts from above. The helicopter unleashes a storm of bullets, shattering windows and tearing through the room. Tyler shields the family, keeping them low until the firing stops. Then move. He leads them toward the elevator. Above, soldiers rappel onto the roof. On the streets below, police units arrive, but they're quickly overpowered by the incoming forces before they can intervene. The group reaches the garage and rushes into a van, but in the chaos, Sandro slips away. Yaz immediately goes after him. The rest try to drive out, but they're cut off. Nagazi fighters open fire, forcing them to reverse and retreat. Out on the street, Sandro comes face to face with Zorob. Gunfire erupts. Zorob fires toward Yaz Khan, forcing him into cover. Both men try to pull Sandro to their side, their voices clashing over the noise. Then another vehicle arrives, Nick. The Nagazi respond instantly, firing a rocket at her car. The explosion throws everything into chaos. In that moment, Zorob grabs Sandro and pulls him into his vehicle. Yaz helps Nick out of the wreck. Together, they return fire, holding off the attackers just long enough. A grenade creates space, allowing them to retreat back inside the building. Meanwhile, inside the garage, Tyler holds the line. With Ketavan and Nina staying hidden in the van, Tyler takes on wave after wave of enemies. One by one, he brings them down. The final attacker closes in for a direct fight, but Tyler overpowers him, finishing the encounter with a well-timed explosive. Outside, Nick and Yaz continue engaging enemies before heading upward via the elevator. At the same time, Tyler gets Ketavan and Nina into another vehicle and pushes forward, but they don't get far. Heavy fire forces them to stop. With no other option, Tyler steps out and re-enters the fight. He clears multiple attackers, creating just enough breathing room. Then, briefly, a police helicopter appears overhead, offering support. But it's short-lived. A rocket streaks upward, striking the aircraft and bringing it down. The situation tightens again. Tyler keeps pushing, taking down more enemies before carving out a path. With no vehicle left, he leads Ketavan and Nina back on foot, moving quickly toward the building. They reach the elevator just in time, moments before Zorob launches another attack from a concealed vehicle. Elsewhere, Sandro grows increasingly anxious about his mother's fate. Avtandil responds coldly. If he wanted her safe, he shouldn't have made that call. On the rooftop, Nick and Yaz aim for the extraction helicopter arranged by their allies, but when they arrive, it's already surrounded by Nagazi forces. A firefight breaks out immediately. Nick takes position, providing cover fire. She orders Yaz to go help Tyler. Yaz heads down, moving through the building, engaging enemies along the way. He fights through them, but not without taking serious damage. At the same time on the roof, Nick is hit. The impact throws her off balance. She collapses onto a lower glass structure, crashing through alongside an enemy soldier. The soldier loses grip and falls away, but Nick is left hanging, barely holding on. Below, Tyler sees it happen. Without hesitation, he fights through the last opponent in his path, then launches himself through a window, grabbing Nick just before she falls. Now both of them hang precariously on the fragile glass surface. One wrong move, and they're both going down. Just as the situation hangs by a thread, Zorob suddenly steps into view and fires, his shot striking Tyler rake in the hand. The impact is brutal, but Tyler refuses to let go. His grip holds. Then another shift. Nick Khan regains consciousness at the perfect moment. With no hesitation, she raises her weapon and fires, shattering the fragile glass beneath Zorob. The surface gives way instantly, leaving him hanging precariously. Tyler doesn't waste a second. Using what strength he has left, he pulls Nick upward and throws her through a nearby window, giving her a chance to regroup with the others. She moves quickly, reaching the family and taking down the remaining Nagazi fighters threatening them. Soon, she reconnects with Yaz Khan, and together they push toward the rooftop. Behind them, Tyler and Zorob pull themselves back up and immediately collide again. The fight resumes, raw, relentless, each blow heavier than the last. Tyler finally draws his knife, ready to end it, but before he can strike, the weakened glass beneath them collapses entirely. Zorob drops through. Tyler doesn't follow. Instead, he turns and makes his way to the roof, where the rest of the team is already boarding the extraction helicopter. They're seconds from escape. Then Zorob reappears, firing from behind cover. His shot hits Yaz. Tyler returns fire, forcing Zorob to duck back while the others rush into the helicopter. It lifts off, pulling them away from immediate danger. Inside, Tyler tries to stabilize Yaz. He does everything he can, but the injuries are too severe. Not long after, Yaz slips away. The loss hits hard. They retreat to Tyler's remote cabin, far from the chaos. There, the weight of everything finally settles in. Nick quietly cleans Yaz's body, grief written across her face, while Tyler treats his own wounds in silence. Then an unexpected arrival. Mia appears. The reunion between her and her sister is emotional, filled with relief and disbelief. Later, Mia sits down with Tyler. What follows is honest, painful. Tyler apologizes for leaving, for not being there when their son needed him most. He explains that it wasn't indifference, it was fear. He couldn't face watching his child fade away, and instead he ran. Elsewhere, tensions within the Nagazi reach a breaking point. Aftendil attempts to reason with Zorob, pointing out the heavy losses they've suffered over one mission. With Sandro now in their custody, he suggests it's time to move forward, but Zorob has no interest in reason. Without warning, he turns on Aftendil, ordering one of his men to eliminate him. The act shocks Sandro. The people he believed were his family reveal their true nature in that moment. Hours later, Tyler's phone rings. It's Zorob. He proposes a meeting, an airfield near St. George's Church. Tyler agrees, but not for negotiation. Despite Nick's warnings, Tyler prepares for war. He arms himself heavily and heads out alone. At the airfield, he moves quietly, taking down guards one by one. Then, an explosion. He destroys Zorob's plane, cutting off any escape. Zorob and Sandro flee. Tyler advances relentlessly. Vehicles erupt around him as he clears his path, engaging every enemy that stands in his way. Even after taking a serious wound to the stomach, he keeps moving focused, driven. The pursuit leads him to the church. Inside, something feels off. It's a trap. Zorob stands waiting with Sandro beside him. Explosives are strapped to the boy, and Zorob holds the detonator. Tyler can't risk a shot. Zorob forces Sandro forward, ordering him to take Tyler's weapon and avenge his father. But Sandro can't do it. He freezes, torn between fear, anger, and doubt. Zorob loses patience, preparing to act himself, and then the door bursts open. Nick enters from behind, but Zorob reacts quickly, pulling Sandro in front of him as a shield, forcing Nick to drop her weapon. For a brief second, everything stops. Tyler catches Sandro's eye and gives a subtle signal. Sandro moves. He grabs the detonator, breaking free from Zorob's control. In the same instant, Nick draws a backup weapon, and the room erupts into gunfire. She's hit during the exchange, badly wounded, but still standing. Tyler charges forward, tackling Zorob. What follows is a brutal, close-quarters fight. They tear through the church, using whatever they can, wood, metal, anything within reach. Nearby, Sandro manages to remove the explosives from himself. He hands the detonator to Nick, apologizing for everything. She quickly disables the threat. The fight between Tyler and Zorob intensifies, both men battered, both refusing to stop. Finally, Tyler gains the advantage. He grabs a large nail and drives it into Zorob repeatedly. Still, Zorob refuses to let go, ranting, clinging to vengeance even as he fades. Tyler ends it, a final shot, silence. Moments later, Tyler rushes to Nick, checking her condition, but before they can regroup, authorities arrive. The Austrian police secure the scene and detain everyone involved. Days pass. Tyler and Nick now find themselves behind bars in Austria. Nick receives medical treatment and begins to recover. One day, Mia visits Tyler. She brings news. Ketavan and her children have entered witness protection, trading information about the Nagazi for safety. Then she shares something more personal. Their son didn't remember Tyler as someone who abandoned him. Instead, he remembered a father who went out into the world to protect others. He looked up to him. That truth hits Tyler harder than anything else. Time moves on. One day, Tyler is escorted out, told he's being transferred. But once he's placed into a car, it becomes clear this isn't routine. Someone is waiting. Alcott. He offers Tyler a deal, a way out of prison. In exchange, another job. Tyler hesitates. Then comes the final piece. Nick's freedom is part of the offer. That's enough. After everything, Tyler agrees. The story doesn't begin with triumph. It begins with survival. Tyler Rake isn't coming back as a hero. He's coming back as someone who barely made it out alive. After the events of the last mission, he's broken, physically, mentally, emotionally. And the film doesn't rush past that state. It lingers in it. It allows that damage to exist, not as a brief obstacle, but as a defining condition. You can feel the weight in how he moves, in how he exists within space. This isn't recovery as a montage, it's recovery as a burden. Every step forward feels earned, and even then it never quite feels complete. Pulled from the edge, dragged through recovery, and left with nothing but time to sit with everything he's been through. And that time becomes its own kind of pressure, because when the noise fades, when the mission is over, what's left isn't relief, it's confrontation. The memories don't soften, they sharpen. The silence doesn't comfort, it isolates. The kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful, it feels empty. And in that emptiness, the film quietly builds something important, the idea that survival isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of a different kind of struggle. So he disappears, far away from the chaos, away from the violence, away from the life that nearly took everything from him. And there's something telling about that choice. It's not just escape, it's avoidance. A deliberate attempt to disconnect from a world that has defined him for too long. But the film subtly suggests that this kind of distance isn't sustainable. Because when your identity is built around conflict, stepping away doesn't erase it. It just leaves you suspended between who you were and who you don't yet know how to become. For a moment, it feels like this is where his story ends, not with closure, but with exhaustion, not with resolution, but with a kind of quiet surrender. But in this world, endings don't last, not for someone like Tyler. Not in a world that constantly pulls people like him back into its orbit, because just when it seems like Tyler is done, someone finds him, a stranger, calm, calculated, and carrying an offer that isn't just another job, it's something deeper. There's an immediate tonal shift here. The introduction of this figure doesn't come with urgency or chaos, it comes with control. And that control makes the moment feel more deliberate, more inevitable. This isn't coincidence. It feels like destiny catching up. This time, the mission isn't about money. It isn't about contracts. It's about connection. And that distinction matters, because it reframes Tyler's involvement not as obligation, but as choice. A woman and her children, trapped inside a brutal prison, caught in a situation tied directly to Tyler's past. And that connection adds emotional gravity to what could have been a straightforward setup. It's no longer just about extraction, it's about accountability, about unfinished ties, about the idea that some responsibilities don't disappear, no matter how far you run, a family he can't ignore, a responsibility he can't walk away from, and the film leans into that inevitability. It doesn't present this as a heroic decision, it presents it as something almost instinctive, as if, despite everything he's been through, this is still who he is, and just like that, the quiet life is over. What follows isn't just another extraction, it's something more layered, more complicated, because getting them out is only the beginning, and that's where the film begins to shift structurally. It challenges the expectation that the mission is the story, and instead positions the mission as the entry point into something far more expansive. From the moment Tyler steps back into that world, everything escalates. The mission spirals. The danger expands, and what starts as a rescue quickly turns into something far bigger than anyone expected. The narrative widens in a way that feels almost overwhelming, as if the film is intentionally breaking the boundaries it initially sets. This isn't just about saving lives, it's about what happens after, and that after becomes the real narrative engine. The consequences, the fallout, the chain reactions that ripple outward, those are what give the story its momentum. Because in Extraction II, the job doesn't end when the target is secured. That's where the real fight begins, and that idea fundamentally reshapes the pacing. It keeps the film from ever settling into a predictable rhythm. Sequels usually follow a familiar rule, do the same thing again, just bigger. But Extraction II doesn't just go bigger, it goes further. It expands not just in scale, but in intent. From the very beginning, you can feel it. The scale has expanded, the world feels wider, the stakes feel heavier, and everything that worked in the first film has been pushed hard. There's a sense that nothing is being held back this time, that the filmmakers are fully committing to the identity they established, without hesitation. This isn't a story trying to reinvent itself. It knows exactly what made the original connect, and instead of changing direction, it doubles down. More movement, more intensity, more chaos, but also more confidence in how those elements are delivered. The mission itself is no longer confined to a single environment. It stretches across locations, across situations, across layers of conflict, and that expansion creates a feeling of unpredictability. Just when you think you understand the boundaries of the story, it pushes beyond them. What starts in one place quickly evolves into something much larger, something harder to contain, and that escalation never really slows down. It builds in waves, each one carrying more weight than the last. Every sequence feels designed to outdo the last, not just in size, but in ambition. There's a clear intention to not just continue the formula, but to stress test it. The action isn't just repeated, it's extended. It lasts longer. It moves through more space, it becomes more complex, and that complexity isn't just about choreography, it's about how the film navigates through it. The transitions between moments feel more fluid, more continuous, as if the film is trying to erase the boundaries between individual set pieces. Where the first film introduced the idea, this one fully commits to it. It takes that foundational approach and pushes it to its limits, exploring how far it can go without breaking. Even visually, everything feels amplified. The environments are more varied, the staging is more elaborate, the movement of the camera, the choreography of the action, it all feels like it's operating on a larger canvas. There's a sense of spatial awareness that becomes more pronounced, as if the film wants you to feel every shift in location, every change in environment. The world isn't just bigger, it's more dynamic. And that dynamism feeds directly into the film's pacing, constantly propelling it forward. But what makes this escalation interesting is that it's not just about scale, it's about confidence. This is a film that knows its identity. It understands its strengths, and instead of pulling back or trying to reshape itself into something else, it leans deeper into what it already is. There's no hesitation in its approach, no attempt to soften its edges or broaden its appeal. It's focused, intentional, and fully committed to delivering exactly what it promises. That's why for many viewers, this doesn't just feel like a continuation, it feels like a level up. Not because it changes the formula, but because it executes it with greater assurance. At the same time, that expansion comes with a cost, because when everything gets bigger, the gaps become more visible too. The simplicity of the story stands out more, the logic stretches further, and the film starts to rely more heavily on momentum to carry it through, and that reliance becomes part of the experience. The film doesn't always ask you to believe, it asks you to keep up, to stay within its rhythm long enough that the questions don't interrupt the flow. But for those willing to go along with it, that escalation is exactly the point. It becomes less about narrative precision and more about experiential intensity. This is a sequel that doesn't hesitate. It takes what came before and turns up the volume. And whether that makes it better or just louder depends entirely on what you're here for. Because from the moment Extraction II finds its rhythm, it makes one thing absolutely clear. This film knows exactly what it is. And it doesn't pretend to be anything else. There's a clarity in that approach that shapes the entire viewing experience. This isn't a story that slowly builds toward action. This isn't a film that balances genres or shifts tone. This is action, pure, relentless, unapologetic action, and that purity defines everything around it. It dictates how scenes are structured, how characters are used, how tension is maintained. Everything else exists around it, but the action is the center. The story, it's there to move us forward. The characters, they guide us through the chaos. The dialogue, it fills the gaps between impact. But the real language of this film is movement. And not just movement as spectacle, but movement as storytelling. Fists connecting, gunfire erupting, bodies crashing through space. Each moment communicates urgency, danger, and consequence without needing to slow down and explain itself. Momentum becomes the film's most important tool. Momentum that never truly settles. And once it starts, it doesn't stop. There's a deliberate refusal to let the energy drop, to let the audience step outside of the experience. The film commits to a pace where every moment feels like it's building into the next collision. One sequence bleeds into another. One confrontation leads directly into the next escalation. And that continuity creates a sense of immersion that's almost overwhelming. There's barely time to breathe, and that's intentional, because this isn't about reflection, it's about immersion. It's about pulling the audience into a constant state of forward motion where the only way out is through. The camera doesn't just observe the action, it stays inside it. It refuses the safety of distance. Instead of framing events from the outside, it embeds itself within the motion, locking onto the characters as if it's tethered to their momentum. It moves with intention, not just to follow, but to participate. Every turn, every sudden shift in direction, every burst of movement feels like the camera is reacting in real time. And that choice fundamentally reshapes how the film is experienced. It removes the sense of spectatorship and replaces it with proximity. You're not watching something unfold, you're being carried through it, step by step, impact by impact. It follows the energy. Not just the physical movement, but the emotional intensity behind it. The urgency isn't just conveyed through what happens, it's embedded in how it's shown. The framing tightens when pressure builds. The motion accelerates when chaos takes over. The camera becomes a conduit for tension, translating the instability of the situation into something you can feel visually. It places you in the middle of something constantly unfolding, constantly shifting, constantly intensifying. And because of that, there's no stable ground, no fixed perspective to retreat to. Everything is in flux, and the camera mirrors that instability with precision. And that commitment defines everything. It's not a stylistic flourish that appears in isolated moments, it's a guiding principle. Even when the film slows down, it doesn't really slow down. The surface might calm, but underneath, there's always movement waiting to break through. The pauses feel transitional, like a held breath rather than a moment of rest. It just prepares for the next surge, the next encounter, the next wave of impact. You can sense the film constantly recalibrating, setting up the next escalation before the current one has fully settled. That's why the pacing feels so relentless. It's structured to avoid stillness entirely. That's why for so many viewers the experience feels immediate, physical, almost exhausting at times, because the film isn't giving you space to detach. It's maintaining a level of intensity that demands engagement, not just attention. The constant motion, the lack of visual relief, the way sequences overlap and extend, it creates a kind of sensory pressure. And that pressure becomes part of the film's identity. It's not just about what's happening, it's about how much of it you're asked to absorb without pause, because the film isn't asking you to think first, it's asking you to feel it, to respond instinctively rather than analytically. The structure supports that approach. It prioritizes sensation over contemplation, momentum over reflection, and that's where its identity becomes undeniable. This isn't trying to be a layered drama. It isn't trying to reinvent storytelling. It isn't even trying to surprise you with complexity. It's built around one core idea: deliver action at the highest level it possibly can. And everything else is shaped to serve that objective. For some, that clarity is its greatest strength. There's something refreshing about a film that understands its purpose so completely and executes it without hesitation. There's no confusion about tone, no mixed signals about what kind of experience it's offering. It's direct, focused, unapologetic. For others, that same clarity becomes a limitation. Because when the film commits so fully to one mode, it leaves less room for variation, less space for contrast. And without that contrast, the intensity can start to feel constant rather than dynamic. But either way, there's no confusion about what Extraction II is trying to do. It's not hiding behind anything. It steps forward and lets the action speak for itself. And in doing so, it places a tremendous amount of weight on how that action is executed. Because when that's your primary language, every sequence has to deliver. And then there's the moment, the sequence that defines the entire film. Because no matter what you think about Extraction II as a whole, this is the part everyone comes back to, not just because of its scale, but because of how completely it embodies the film's philosophy. A single, extended stretch of action, designed to feel like it never cuts. And from a structural standpoint, it's more than just a standout, it's a centerpiece. A statement of intent that says, this is what we can do when everything aligns. It begins quietly enough, a controlled entry, a calculated move into hostile territory. There's a sense of precision in those early moments. Movements are measured, decisions feel deliberate. The tension builds not through chaos, but through anticipation. But within minutes, that control disappears. The situation erupts, and from that point on, the film doesn't let go. The shift from order to disorder happens rapidly, but it feels organic, like a system breaking under pressure rather than a sudden narrative pivot. What makes this sequence so striking isn't just its length, it's the way it evolves. It refuses to stay static. It doesn't lock itself into one type of action or one kind of environment. It keeps transforming, moving from confined spaces to open chaos, from close combat to large-scale confrontation. And with each transition, the energy recalibrates. The threats change, the movement adapts. The rhythm shifts just enough to keep it from becoming repetitive. Every shift feels seamless, like one continuous breath that never fully releases. There's no clear endpoint, no reset, just forward motion that keeps building. The camera doesn't sit back and observe. It stays with Tyler. It runs beside him. It follows him through corridors, across obstacles, through escalating waves of danger. And that proximity creates a kind of narrative alignment. You experience the sequence from his perspective, not just visually, but physically. The obstacles feel immediate because the camera encounters them when he does. The space feels continuous because there's no interruption to remind you otherwise. It moves through environments as if it's part of the action itself, ducking, weaving, adjusting, reacting. And that responsiveness gives the sequence a sense of unpredictability, even within its carefully constructed design. And that creates something rare, a sense of immersion that feels immediate, almost overwhelming. The lack of visible cuts removes the usual markers that separate moments. Without those breaks, time feels compressed. Events feel connected in a way that heightens their intensity. You're not watching the sequence unfold. You're inside it, and that distinction is what elevates it beyond spectacle into something more experiential. Now, technically, it may not be a true single take. There are moments, subtle transitions, carefully hidden seams, where the illusion is maintained rather than absolute, but that doesn't diminish what's happening here. Because the achievement isn't just in the technique, it's in the coordination, the timing, the choreography, the precision required to align movement, camera, performance, and environment into something that feels continuous. It's about synchronization on a massive scale. Every element has to be in the right place at the right time, with no room for error. Everything has to work together, and for the most part, it does. There's a rhythm to it. A flow that carries you forward without interruption, not because the film is cutting between moments, but because the movement itself becomes the transition. One action leads directly into the next, not through editing, but through spatial progression. That's what makes it stand out, not just as a spectacle, but as a statement, a demonstration of control within chaos. This is the film at its most confident, its most ambitious, its most focused. And ironically, it also creates one of the film's biggest challenges, because when you deliver something this strong, this early, everything that follows is measured against it. The bar is set at a level that's difficult to sustain. And even when the film continues to deliver high-intensity moments, they exist in the shadow of what came before, and very little can match that same intensity. Not because the rest of the film lacks effort, but because this sequence concentrates so much of its ambition into one continuous experience. It becomes a reference point, a benchmark that defines how the rest of the film is perceived. But in that moment, during that uninterrupted surge of motion, Extraction II reaches its peak, not just in scale, but in execution. It's where concept, technique, and performance align most completely. There's a constant tension running through Extraction II, and it sits right at the heart of how the action feels. Not how big it is, not how loud it is, but how real it feels, because scale alone doesn't determine impact. It's the texture of the action, the sense of weight, of resistance, of consequence, that determines whether it connects on a deeper level. Because this film exists between two extremes. On one side, grounded physical action. On the other, large-scale, effects-driven spectacle. And navigating that space is where the film either maintains its grip or starts to lose it. The balance isn't always stable. It shifts depending on the demands of each sequence. At its best, Extraction II feels raw. There's a tactile quality to the movement. You can feel the weight behind every hit. The strain in every movement, the impact of bodies colliding with the environment. The action feels close, tangible, almost uncomfortable in how immediate it is, and that discomfort becomes part of the immersion. It reminds you that what you're watching, no matter how heightened, still carries a sense of physical consequence. And when the film stays in that space, it becomes incredibly engaging, because there's a consistency to the experience. A sense that the rules of the world are being respected, that the action, no matter how intense, is grounded in something you can understand on a physical level. There's a clarity to it that makes every movement feel purposeful. But then it pushes further, the scale increases, the chaos expands, and gradually that grounded feeling starts to blur. The film begins to prioritize scope over texture, the environments become larger. The set pieces become more elaborate, and with that expansion, the sense of immediacy starts to shift. The action becomes bigger, but also more artificial, not in a way that breaks the experience completely, but in a way that subtly changes how it's perceived. Moments begin to feel constructed rather than lived in. The choreography remains impressive, but the sense of spontaneity starts to fade. The danger feels less immediate, less tactile. And instead of pulling you deeper into the scene, it creates a slight distance. You start to see the design behind the action, rather than just experiencing its impact. Not because the spectacle isn't impressive, it is. The scale, the ambition, the technical execution, they're all undeniable, but because it starts to feel less real. And that shift changes everything. It alters the relationship between the viewer and the action. What was once immersive becomes observational. What once felt immediate begins to feel orchestrated. And in a film so dependent on physical intensity, that difference becomes impossible to ignore. Because this franchise thrives when the action feels like it could almost happen, when the environment matters, when the movement has weight, when the characters feel physically present within the chaos. There's a kind of tactile realism that becomes the foundation for everything else. You notice it in how spaces are used, how obstacles aren't just background, but part of the choreography, how every movement seems to respond to something real within the frame. The geography of each sequence becomes readable, almost intuitive, allowing you to track not just where characters are, but how they navigate danger. That's what gives the action its grip. It feels anchored, even when the stakes are heightened. That's why certain sequences stand out more than others. the ones that stay grounded, feel more intense, more controlled, more immersive. There's a clarity to them, a sense that every movement has consequence. You can follow the logic of the space, the direction of motion, the cause and effect of each decision. And because of that, the tension feels earned rather than imposed. You're not just reacting to noise or scale, you're responding to something that feels physically coherent. While the more exaggerated moments, despite being larger, can sometimes feel less impactful, not because they lack ambition, but because they start to drift away from that sense of connection. When scale overtakes structure, the immediacy begins to fade. The action becomes something you observe rather than something you experience. It's still impressive, still technically accomplished, but the emotional engagement shifts. The stakes feel bigger, yet somehow less personal. It's a delicate balance. Push too far into realism, and the film risks losing scale. The spectacle shrinks, the sense of escalation flattens, and the film can start to feel contained. Push too far into spectacle, and it risks losing connection. The weight disappears, the impact softens, and the action becomes abstract. Extraction II moves between both, sometimes seamlessly, sometimes unevenly. And that unevenness isn't necessarily a flaw, it becomes part of the film's texture. A constant negotiation between two different approaches to action, and that contrast becomes one of the most defining aspects of the experience. Because it creates variation, but also tension. You're constantly shifting between moments that pull you in and moments that push you slightly back, between sequences that feel immediate and ones that feel constructed. And that fluctuation shapes how the film is received on a moment-to-moment basis. Because in the end, it's not just about how much action there is, it's about whether you feel it, or just watch it. Whether the film manages to maintain that connection, or whether it slips into something more distant. And that distinction is what determines how lasting the experience becomes. If there's one thing Extraction II refuses to do, it's slow down. From the moment the mission begins, the film locks into a rhythm, and once it finds that rhythm, it rarely breaks it. And that rhythm isn't just fast, it's continuous. It's designed to eliminate gaps, to remove the traditional rise and fall of pacing and replace it with something more linear, a steady climb that never quite levels out. This is a movie driven by momentum, not quiet reflection, not gradual buildup, but constant forward motion, and that forward motion becomes the structure itself. It dictates how scenes transition, how tension is maintained, how the narrative progresses. Every scene feels like it's pushing into the next, not waiting for resolution, but moving past it. There's barely any space between events. One situation escalates, and before it can fully settle, another one takes its place. And that overlap creates a sense of urgency that feels almost relentless. There's no clear separation between cause and consequence. They blend together, creating a continuous chain of action that rarely pauses long enough to be fully processed. It creates a sense that everything is unfolding in real time, like the film itself is in a hurry, as if stopping, even briefly, would break the illusion it's trying to maintain, and that urgency becomes infectious. It pulls you along with it, forcing you to stay engaged simply to keep up, and that works because it keeps you engaged. There's always something happening, always movement, always tension building into the next sequence. The film doesn't rely on anticipation, it relies on continuation. The story doesn't linger, it advances, relentlessly, and that relentlessness becomes one of its defining traits. Even the quieter moments don't feel like true pauses. They feel like transitions, brief resets before the next surge of intensity hits, moments where the film recalibrates just enough to set up what comes next, but never enough to fully disengage, and when it does hit, it hits fast. Often without warning, often without buildup, maintaining that sense of unpredictability within its otherwise consistent rhythm. That pace becomes one of the film's strongest tools. It carries the experience forward, even when other elements start to weaken. It acts as a kind of momentum buffer, smoothing over gaps in logic, compressing narrative beats, and keeping the focus on movement rather than detail. It keeps the energy alive. It prevents the film from ever feeling stagnant. But at the same time, that constant momentum comes with a trade-off. Because when a film moves this quickly, when it rarely gives you time to process what just happened, it can start to feel overwhelming. Not in a chaotic way, but in an exhausting one. The intensity doesn't spike and fall, it sustains. And sustained intensity, without variation, can begin to lose its impact over time. There's very little room to breathe. Very little time to sit with the characters, to absorb the consequences, to reflect on anything beyond the immediate moment. Emotional beats pass quickly. Narrative developments move on before they can fully resonate. And that compression can limit how deeply certain elements land. And over time, that can wear you down. What starts as intensity can become fatigue. The same energy that pulls you in can begin to push you away, simply because it never lets up. And that's where the experience becomes subjective. Some viewers thrive on that constant motion. Others start to feel the absence of contrast. Still, for many viewers, that's part of the appeal. This isn't meant to be a slow burn. It's not trying to build toward a distant payoff. It's designed to keep you inside the experience, constantly moving, constantly reacting, constantly pulled forward. And in that sense, it succeeds. It delivers exactly what it sets out to deliver, without hesitation. Because whether you love it or find it overwhelming, there's no denying this. Extraction II never stands still. There's an unspoken agreement that Extraction II asks you to make, not at the halfway point, not after the first big set piece, right from the beginning. It asks you to let go of logic and lean into the experience. And that request isn't subtle. It's embedded in how the film presents its world, how it escalates its stakes, how it handles consequence. Because this is a world where survival stretches beyond realism, where characters endure things that would stop anyone else, where danger escalates far beyond what feels plausible, where every situation seems stacked against the protagonist, and yet, somehow, he keeps moving forward. And the film doesn't treat that as something unusual, it treats it as expected, and the film doesn't try to justify it. It doesn't slow down to explain how things work. It doesn't pause to ground every moment in strict realism. It simply pushes ahead, trusting that the audience will either accept the rules or disengage from them. Again and again, the odds increase, the scale expands, the consequences become more extreme. And the question isn't, is this realistic? The question is, are you willing to go with it? Because the film isn't interested in convincing you, it's interested in carrying you. Because if you are, the film works, the intensity takes over, the momentum carries you, and those exaggerated moments become part of the thrill. They stop feeling like departures from reality and start feeling like extensions of the film's internal logic. But if you're not, that same intensity starts to feel artificial. The convenience becomes noticeable. The coincidences stand out. The survival starts to feel less like resilience and more like invincibility. And once that perception takes hold, it becomes difficult to fully reconnect with the experience. At times, it even begins to resemble something closer to a video game, levels of danger, waves of opposition. Increasing difficulty, but with a character who keeps pushing through, no matter how extreme things become. There's a progression to it, a sense of escalation that mirrors structured challenges rather than organic events. And that's where the divide happens. Some viewers embrace it. They see it as part of the genre, a heightened reality where logic takes a backseat to spectacle. Others struggle with it. Because once that sense of believability slips, it becomes harder to stay fully invested. What's interesting is that the film never tries to resolve this tension. It doesn't pull back. It doesn't adjust its approach. It commits, fully, to a version of reality where escalation matters more than explanation. And in doing so, it defines its own rules. It doesn't ask for permission. It establishes its terms and moves forward. The only question is whether you're willing to accept them. At the center of all this chaos, there's one constant: Tyler Rake, and more importantly, Chris Hemsworth. Because no matter how large the scale becomes, no matter how intense the action gets, the film stands or falls on his presence. And here he carries it, completely. This isn't the version of him audiences have grown used to seeing in bigger franchise roles. There's no lightness here, no playful detachment, no charm used as a shield. The film strips all of that away and replaces it with something far more restrained, far more internal. This performance is heavier, more grounded, more physical, more direct. It feels like a deliberate recalibration, an actor stepping away from familiarity and leaning into something more controlled, more disciplined. He plays Tyler as someone who's been through too much and is still carrying it. And what's striking is how that history isn't delivered through exposition, it's embedded in behavior. It shows up in the pauses, in the way he scans his surroundings, in the way he reacts before he speaks. There's a sense that everything he does is filtered through experience, through memory, through a kind of quiet calculation. You can see it in how he moves. Every step feels deliberate. Every reaction feels controlled. There's no wasted motion. No unnecessary flourish. It's all purpose, all function. There's a weight to his presence, not just in the action, but in the stillness between it. And that stillness becomes one of the performance's most effective tools. In a film that rarely stops moving, his ability to hold space without doing anything becomes a form of contrast. It gives the character dimension without needing to spell anything out. He doesn't overplay emotion. He doesn't need to. The character isn't built around expression. It's built around endurance, around how much he can carry without breaking, how much he can absorb without collapsing. And that's where Chris Hemsworth excels. He understands that this character isn't about charisma, it's about presence. When the action begins, he doesn't just participate in it, he anchors it. Everything around him is designed to escalate, to expand, to intensify, but his performance keeps it grounded. The choreography, the camera movement, the scale of the sequences, all of it revolves around his ability to make it feel believable within the film's heightened reality. There's a physical commitment here that's impossible to ignore. Not just in the obvious sense, the fights, the movement, the endurance, but in how consistently that physicality is maintained. It never feels like a switch that turns on for action scenes and off for quieter moments. It's constant. The fights feel heavy, the impact feels real, the exhaustion feels earned, and that continuity is what gives the performance credibility. You believe that the same person enduring these sequences is the one standing in silence afterward, carrying the aftermath. And that physicality becomes the backbone of the film's identity, because when everything else stretches towards spectacle, his performance keeps pulling it back towards something tangible. It gives the film a center of gravity. But it's not just about strength, there's something quieter underneath it, a sense that this isn't a character chasing something, but someone trying to hold onto what little remains. There's no forward-looking ambition driving him, no clear goal beyond the immediate task. Instead, there's a kind of emotional inertia, a man continuing to move, because stopping would mean confronting everything he's trying to avoid. A man who wasn't supposed to make it this far, and now doesn't quite know what to do with that survival. That internal conflict isn't always fully explored, but it lingers beneath the surface. It informs how he interacts with others, how he approaches the mission, how he carries himself through each moment. And Hemsworth gives it just enough presence to keep the character from becoming one-dimensional. He doesn't overstate it. He lets it exist quietly, almost passively, allowing the audience to feel it rather than be told. That's what separates Tyler Rake from being just another action lead. He doesn't talk much. He doesn't explain himself. He doesn't need to. The performance is carried through presence, through movement, through restraint. And in a film built around constant motion, that stillness becomes just as important. It becomes a counterbalance to everything happening around him. Because when everything else is escalating, he remains the center, a fixed point in the middle of chaos, and without that, none of this works. For a film so heavily built around one man, Extraction II doesn't move alone. Because behind Tyler Rake, there's a team, and this time, that team matters more. The film expands its perspective just enough to allow other characters to influence the rhythm, to shape the direction of events rather than simply react to them. The film doesn't just position its supporting characters as background presence or mission support. It gives them space to act, to react, to contribute to the flow of the story in ways that feel active rather than decorative. And that shift, even if subtle, adds a layer of dimensionality to the narrative. It makes the world feel inhabited rather than centered exclusively around a single figure. Nick Khan stands out immediately. She's not just coordinating from a distance. She's involved, engaged, moving through the same danger, making the same decisions, carrying the same weight, and that involvement changes how her character is perceived. She's not an extension of Tyler, she's a counterpart. There's a competence, a control, a sense of agency that places her firmly within the action rather than adjacent to it. There's a sense that she isn't simply assisting Tyler, she's operating alongside him, and that dynamic shifts the balance. It creates a partnership rather than a hierarchy. Their interactions feel functional, built on trust rather than exposition. There's an understanding between them that doesn't need to be explained. It's demonstrated through how they move together, how they anticipate each other. Then there's Yaz. He brings a different kind of energy, not by breaking the tone, but by adding texture to it. His presence introduces small variations in rhythm, subtle shifts in interaction that keep the experience from becoming too uniform. There's a natural rhythm between him and Tyler, small moments of exchange that humanize the experience without slowing it down. These moments don't interrupt the pacing, they integrate into it, adding dimension without disrupting flow. He isn't just there to fill space. He has purpose, function, presence within the team. And that sense of purpose makes his involvement feel necessary rather than incidental. Together, they form something that feels closer to a unit than a supporting cast, a group operating within the same environment, responding to the same pressures, contributing to the same outcome. But the film doesn't stop there. The people being rescued, the family at the center of the mission, aren't just passive objectives. They're part of the conflict. Their decisions, their reactions, their emotional ties to the situation, they influence how everything unfolds. And that influence adds unpredictability, because now the mission isn't just about execution, it's about adaptation, about responding not just to external threats but to internal dynamics. That adds complexity. Because now the mission isn't just about extraction, It's about managing relationships, tension, and unpredictability within the group itself. The emotional stakes become intertwined with the physical ones, creating moments where decisions carry both immediate and personal consequences. And then there's the opposition. The antagonist isn't just a distant threat, he's present, persistent, and driven by something personal, and that personal element sharpens the conflict. It gives it direction, focus, intent. The pursuit isn't random, it's targeted, and that targeting creates a sense of inevitability. There's no escape from it, only confrontation. That presence gives the conflict direction. It turns the pursuit into something more focused, more intense. The threat feels active, not reactive. It's constantly pushing forward, constantly closing the distance, maintaining pressure throughout. All of this contributes to a larger picture. A film that may revolve around one central figure, but is constantly shaped by the people around him. Each character, regardless of how much screen time they have, influences the flow of events in some way. Some characters have more depth than others, some leave a stronger impression, some feel underused, but collectively they serve a purpose. They expand the world, they complicate the mission, they give the action something to revolve around. They introduce variables that prevent the narrative from becoming too linear, because without them, it would just be movement, continuous, relentless, but ultimately isolated, and here it becomes interaction. A network of actions and reactions, decisions and consequences, all feeding into the same forward momentum. Beneath all the movement, beneath the impact, the chaos, the constant escalation, Extraction II tries to anchor itself in something quieter. Something personal, not as a dominant theme but as an undercurrent. Something that runs beneath the surface, occasionally breaking through. Because this time the mission isn't just another assignment, it's connected. Not through contracts or obligation, but through people, through relationships, through a past that hasn't fully let go. And that connection, even when it's not fully explored, adds a layer of emotional context to everything that follows. And that shift matters, because it changes how Tyler moves through the story. The intention behind his actions becomes more defined, more personal, and that subtle change reframes everything around him. This isn't just about completing a task, it's about who he's doing it for, and why he can't walk away. There's an emotional tether now, something that pulls him forward even when logic might suggest otherwise. And that tether gives the mission a different kind of urgency, not just survival, but responsibility. There's an attempt here to give the action weight, not just physical weight, but emotional weight. To make every decision feel like it carries consequence beyond survival. And that effort shows up in the way the film frames its central conflict. The stakes aren't just about getting in and out, they're about what happens to the people caught in between. About what those outcomes mean beyond the immediate moment. You see it in the family at the center of the mission, a mother trying to protect her children, a child caught between loyalty and influence. A situation shaped by control, fear, and dependency. And what makes that dynamic interesting is how it complicates the mission in ways that aren't purely tactical. These aren't just objectives to be secured, they're individuals with their own emotional realities, their own internal conflicts that don't always align with the plan. These aren't just objectives, they're complications. They introduce variables that can't be predicted or controlled in the same way as external threats. Their presence disrupts the clean execution of the mission. It forces adjustments, hesitation, recalibration. It creates moments where the conflict isn't just external, it's internal, emotional, personal. Decisions aren't just about strategy, they're about understanding, about trust, about navigating relationships under pressure. And then there's Tyler himself, a man who wasn't meant to still be here, now forced to move forward anyway. There's a quiet contradiction in that idea. Survival, in his case, doesn't feel like a victory, it feels like an unresolved continuation. And that unresolved state gives his actions a different tone. There's a sense that this mission isn't just about saving others, it's about finding something to hold onto, a reason to keep going. A way to reconnect with something human after everything he's lost. The film touches on that, sometimes subtly, sometimes directly. It appears in brief moments, glances, pauses, small interactions that hint at something deeper beneath the surface. And when it works, it adds a layer that the action alone can't provide. It gives context to the movement, meaning to the decisions, a sense that there's something driving him beyond instinct. But it doesn't always land the same way for everyone. Because while the intention is clear, the execution doesn't always go deep enough. The emotional beats are present, but they're often brief. They appear, they register, and then they're carried forward by the film's momentum before they have time to fully resonate. There's a sense that the film acknowledges these layers, but doesn't always stay with them long enough to fully explore their potential. For some viewers, that's enough. The connection is there. The stakes feel real. The mission feels more than just physical. The emotional undercurrent adds just enough depth to elevate the experience. For others, it feels underdeveloped. Like the film reaches for something deeper, but doesn't fully commit to it, that it introduces emotional complexity, but doesn't allow it to breathe, and that creates a divide. Because at its core, Extraction II is still driven by action. The emotion is there to support it, not replace it. It enhances the experience, but it never overtakes it. The film never shifts its focus away from movement as the primary force, but even in that limited space, it adds something important, because without those personal stakes, this would just be another mission, functional, efficient, driven purely by external goals. With them, it becomes something more, even if only for a moment, even if only in glimpses. For all the scale, all the precision, all the undeniable craft on display, this is where Extraction II starts to crack. Because beneath the spectacle, the foundation isn't as strong. The film builds upward with confidence, but the base it's building on doesn't always carry the same level of depth. The story itself is simple, and not in a refined, stripped-down way, but in a way that often feels functional, designed to support the action rather than stand independently. It serves its purpose, but rarely extends beyond it. It connects the sequences, provides direction, but doesn't always offer substance beyond progression, built to move from one sequence to the next, rather than to stand on its own. And you can feel that in how the narrative unfolds. It doesn't surprise you, it doesn't challenge you, it doesn't linger, it moves, and it keeps moving because it has to, because the structure depends on that forward motion to maintain engagement. Because the moment the action slows down, this is where the film becomes exposed. The absence of that momentum reveals the simplicity underneath. The gaps become more visible, the structure feels thinner. The dialogue in particular is where that weakness becomes most visible. Conversations don't always feel natural. There's a directness to them that feels more functional than expressive. Lines don't always carry weight. They communicate information, but not always emotion. At times, they feel like placeholders, bridges between action beats rather than meaningful exchanges between characters, and that affects everything around it. Because dialogue is often the space where relationships deepen, where motivations become clearer, where emotional stakes are reinforced. When that space feels limited, the surrounding elements feel less defined. The relationships don't fully develop, the emotional moments don't fully land, the characters don't always feel complete. Instead, they exist in service of the next sequence. Their arcs are shaped by necessity rather than exploration. That's the trade-off. The film prioritizes movement over depth, momentum over complexity, and while that works when everything is in motion, it becomes noticeable when things pause. The contrast between high-intensity action and quieter moments highlights what's missing. There's also a sense that the plot relies heavily on convenience. Situations align quickly. Escalations happen without much resistance. Obstacles appear, but they rarely hold for long. The path forward is rarely obstructed in a way that significantly alters direction. It's more about progression than complication. The world bends just enough to keep the story advancing at the pace it wants, and that flexibility supports the film's rhythm, but it also reduces tension in a narrative sense. The unpredictability comes from action, not from structure. And for some viewers, that's perfectly fine, because this isn't a film trying to be intricate. It's not aiming for layered storytelling or deep narrative structure. It's designed to be direct, to move efficiently from one moment to the next without unnecessary complication. But even within that simplicity, there's a gap, a sense that the writing could have done more, not to slow the film down, but to give it more weight. More cohesion, more meaning between the action, small adjustments that could have strengthened the foundation without disrupting the pace. Because right now, the screenplay does its job, but it rarely goes beyond that. It functions effectively, but doesn't elevate itself. And in a film where everything else is pushed to such a high level, that limitation stands out. If there's one area where Extraction II feels completely in control, it's here. Because this is a film shaped by someone who understands action from the inside out. Sam Hargrave doesn't approach these sequences as spectacle alone, he approaches them as construction. As systems of movement that need to align perfectly to achieve their effect. Every movement has intent, every transition has purpose, every beat is designed, and you can feel that precision in the way the film operates. There's a clarity to how sequences are built, how they progress, how they resolve. This isn't chaotic action, it's controlled chaos. Chaos that feels spontaneous on the surface, but is carefully engineered underneath. And that balance between unpredictability and precision is what allows the film to sustain its intensity without collapsing into incoherence. The kind where everything looks unpredictable, but is actually built on careful timing, coordination, and execution. And that illusion of chaos that feels spontaneous is only possible because of how tightly everything is controlled beneath the surface. Nothing is left to chance. Every movement is pre-visualized, every interaction between performers is calibrated, every beat is designed to land at a specific moment. What you're seeing may feel immediate, even chaotic, but underneath it's structured with precision. That's where the stunt work becomes the backbone, not just as a feature of the film, but as its foundation. The physicality of the performances, the way bodies move, collide, react, feel incidental. It feels engineered. You can sense the discipline behind it, the repetition, the coordination, the trust between performers. There's a weight to every action because it's grounded in something real, real movement, real contact, real physical effort. There's a sense that the action isn't just happening, it's being guided, shaped, and maintained through every frame. And that guidance is what prevents it from collapsing into noise. Even at its most intense, there's structure holding it together. You're not just seeing impact, you're seeing intention behind that impact. And that level of control allows the film to do something difficult. It sustains intensity without losing clarity, because one of the biggest challenges in large-scale action is maintaining coherence. As complexity increases, clarity often disappears, but here, even in its most layered sequences, you can track what's happening. You can follow the movement, you understand the space. You know where the characters are in relation to each other, where the threats are coming from, how the environment is being used. That's not accidental, that's direction. It's the result of deliberate choices in how scenes are staged, how they're shot, how they're allowed to unfold. And it extends beyond just the stunts. The camera placement, the choreography between performer and lens, the way sequences are staged to flow rather than fragment. These are decisions that elevate the material beyond its basic structure. Because on paper, much of this is straightforward. The objectives are clear. The progression is direct. There's nothing inherently complex about the setup, but in execution, it becomes something else. It becomes an exercise in craft, in how to take something simple and present it with such precision that it feels dynamic, layered, and engaging. The film doesn't rely on quick cuts to create impact. It relies on continuity, on movement that carries through space, on sequences that unfold rather than break apart. And that choice changes how the action is perceived. Instead of disorienting you with fragmentation, it immerses you through consistency. It allows you to stay within the moment rather than constantly reorienting yourself. That's where Sam Hargrave's background shows most clearly. He understands that action isn't just about what happens. It's about how it happens, how it's seen, how it's felt, how long it's allowed to breathe before the next moment takes over. There's an awareness of rhythm here, not just in pacing, but in physical motion, in how sequences rise, peak, and transition without losing their internal logic. And because of that, even when the writing falters, even when the story simplifies, the film holds its ground, because the direction keeps it grounded in craft. It provides a level of consistency that compensates for areas where the narrative doesn't fully develop. It takes something that could have been routine and pushes it into something far more deliberate, not just bigger, but better executed, more controlled, more precise, more aware of its own mechanics. There's a reason Extraction II feels so immediate, so immersive, and it starts with how it's seen, because this isn't a film that observes action from a distance. It moves with it. The cinematography doesn't just frame the chaos, it enters it. It commits to proximity, to presence, to being inside the movement rather than outside it. It follows the characters through space, through impact, through shifting environments that never stay still for long. And that constant motion gives the visuals a kind of kinetic energy that never settles. The camera feels alive, constantly adjusting, constantly reacting. It's not fixed, it's responsive. It adapts to the action as it unfolds, reinforcing the sense that everything is happening in real time. And that changes the experience. You're not watching from the outside, you're inside the motion. There's no safe distance, no detached perspective. Everything feels immediate because the camera refuses to step back. There's a deliberate emphasis on proximity, close quarters, tight framing. Movement that pulls you into the center of the action rather than letting you step back and process it from afar. And that proximity intensifies everything. Every hit feels closer. Every movement feels sharper. Every shift in space feels more urgent. It creates a sense of urgency, like everything is happening right in front of you, with no barrier in between. And that immediacy becomes one of the film's strongest visual tools. At the same time, the film knows when to expand. It understands that intensity alone isn't enough. You need contrast to give that intensity meaning, so it opens up space when it needs scale. It widens the frame just enough to show the environment, the geography, the scope of what's unfolding, before pulling you right back into the intensity. That balance is key. Because without it, the film would either feel too confined or too distant, too close and you lose perspective, too wide and you lose impact. Instead, it shifts between both, expanding and contracting as needed, adjusting its visual language to match the demands of each moment. And that's where the visual style becomes more than just presentation, it becomes part of the storytelling. The camera isn't static. It travels, it flows, it connects sequences through movement rather than cuts. It creates continuity not just in time, but in space. That's especially evident in the film's most ambitious moments, where the illusion of continuity creates a seamless visual experience. The transitions feel natural, the space feels connected, and the action unfolds as if it's happening in one uninterrupted stretch. That seamlessness removes the usual markers that separate moments, allowing the film to maintain a consistent sense of immersion. Even outside of those sequences, there's a consistency to the way the film is shot. It prioritizes clarity. You can follow what's happening. You understand where the characters are, how they move, how the environment shifts around them. And that clarity becomes essential, especially when everything else is escalating. Without it, the film would risk becoming overwhelming in a way that disconnects rather than engages. There's also a subtle shift in the film's overall look compared to what came before. It feels more polished, more controlled, more deliberate in how it presents its world. The color grading feels more intentional. The contrast between environments is more defined. Each location carries its own visual identity, its own texture. The environments are distinct. The lighting shapes the tone. The visual identity feels more defined, even as the action becomes more chaotic. And that contrast works, because the more chaotic the action becomes, the more important it is for the visual language to remain consistent. Because no matter how intense things get, the camera never loses its grip. It doesn't drift. It doesn't become disoriented. It maintains control, guiding the viewer through each moment with precision. It doesn't just capture the action. It guides you through it. If Extraction II has a language, it speaks in impact, not suggestion, not restraint, but force. A direct, unfiltered expression of intensity that defines how every sequence is delivered. This is a film that doesn't hold back. From the moment the action takes over, it commits to a level of intensity that keeps escalating, scene after scene, encounter after encounter. There's no attempt to moderate it, no effort to soften it. It builds and it keeps building. The scale grows, the confrontations expand, and the sheer volume of conflict becomes impossible to ignore. Each new sequence adds another layer, another level, another escalation that pushes the film further into its own identity. Gunfire erupts, fists collide, chaos spreads, and it doesn't come in bursts. It comes in waves, overlapping, continuous, each one feeding into the next, creating a sustained sense of pressure that rarely lets up. It comes in waves. And those waves aren't isolated. They build on each other, stacking intensity in a way that feels cumulative rather than episodic. What makes it stand out isn't just how often it happens, but how far it goes. There's a clear push toward excess, toward a kind of amplified spectacle where every element is stretched just a little further than expected. The environments grow larger. The confrontations become more layered. The number of moving parts within each sequence increases, creating a sense of density that fills the frame. It's designed to overwhelm, not in a confusing way, but in a sustained, relentless way. The film isn't trying to disorient, it's trying to saturate, to keep adding pressure until the experience becomes almost continuous. There's always something happening, always another layer being added, another obstacle, another surge of intensity that builds on what came before, and that accumulation becomes the defining sensation. You're not reacting to single moments, you're reacting to the buildup of many, and that scale becomes part of the experience, because the film isn't just showing conflict, it's expanding it, taking what could be a contained encounter and stretching it outward, turning individual moments into extended sequences, and those sequences into full-scale set pieces that move across space, across environments, across shifting circumstances. There's a constant sense of expansion, as if no moment is allowed to remain small, but that constant escalation also creates a contrast. For some, it's exhilarating. The sheer volume, the intensity, the commitment to spectacle, it becomes the appeal. There's a kind of purity in that approach. The film promises intensity, and it delivers it without hesitation. It doesn't hold back, doesn't second-guess its direction. It commits fully, and for viewers aligned with that energy, the experience becomes immersive in a very direct way. For others, it becomes too much. Because when everything is intense, when every moment is amplified, the impact can start to blur. The peaks begin to flatten, not because they're less impressive, but because they're no longer contrasted against quieter valleys. The scale remains, but the weight begins to fade. The individual moments lose some of their distinction, blending into a continuous stream rather than standing apart, because without variation, excess can feel routine. And that's where the balance becomes important. The film's strongest moments often come when it pulls that scale back just enough to reconnect with something grounded, when the action is anchored in space, in physicality, in something that feels immediate rather than expansive. When the film grounds its action, when it allows the scale to sit within something tangible, it hits harder, it feels sharper, more immediate, the tension becomes more focused, the impact more concentrated. When it leans fully into spectacle, it impresses. The ambition is clear, the execution is strong, but the connection isn't always as immediate. That's the tension running through it, between power and overload, between intensity and repetition, between the desire to escalate and the need to maintain impact. And Extraction II lives right in the middle of that space, constantly shifting between those two modes, sometimes finding perfect alignment, sometimes leaning too far in one direction. A film that doesn't just deliver action, it amplifies it, until the spectacle becomes the point, not just a feature of the film, but its defining characteristic. Every sequel lives in the shadow of what came before. And Extraction II doesn't try to escape that shadow, it steps directly into it. There's no attempt to distance itself, no effort to redefine its identity. Instead, it embraces the framework that was already established and builds outward from it. From the very beginning, the connection is clear. This isn't a reinvention. It's a continuation built on the same structure, the same identity, the same core idea that defined the first film. You can feel the blueprint underneath it, a mission-driven story, a central character moving through escalating danger, action as the driving force. But where the first film introduced that formula, this one expands it. It doesn't question the structure, it reinforces it. Everything is pushed further, the action is bigger, the sequences last longer, the scale is wider. It's the same foundation, just amplified, and that amplification becomes the defining strategy. And for many viewers, that's exactly what makes it work, because it takes what the original did well and doubles down on it. There's a confidence in that decision, a willingness to lean into familiarity rather than avoid it. It doesn't try to reshape itself into something unfamiliar, it sharpens what it already is. The long, continuous action sequences, bigger the intensity, higher the ambition, clearer. The film feels more assured in how it delivers those elements, more willing to push them further without hesitation. In that sense, it feels like a natural progression, a sequel that understands its strengths and commits to them. It doesn't dilute its identity, it concentrates it, but at the same time, it also inherits the same limitations, because when you build on a foundation, you also carry forward its weaknesses. The simplicity of the story is still there. The lack of depth in the writing carries over. The emotional beats, while slightly expanded, don't always reach their full potential. In some ways, those weaknesses become more noticeable here, because when everything else grows, the gaps grow with it. The contrast between high-level execution in action and more basic execution in narrative becomes sharper. That's where the divide happens. Some viewers see this as an improvement, more confident, more refined, more engaging than the original. Others see it as more of the same, just louder, bigger, but not necessarily better where it matters most. And both perspectives come from the same place, because Extraction II doesn't change the formula, it reinforces it. It takes what worked and builds on top of it, without trying to fix everything underneath. And that's what defines it as a sequel, not a departure, but an extension, a continuation of an established identity rather than a redefinition of it. To understand Extraction II, you have to place it where it belongs, not just as a sequel, but as part of a much larger conversation. Because this film doesn't exist in isolation, it sits alongside modern action cinema, constantly inviting comparison. You can feel the echoes, the precision and momentum that call to mind John Wick, the large-scale set pieces and escalating chaos that resemble Fast and Furious, the close-quarters intensity and raw combat energy that reflect The Raid 2. These parallels aren't accidental. They place the film within a lineage of modern action that prioritizes execution and physicality. And even beyond modern films, there's something older in its DNA, a throwback quality. The kind of action vehicle that once revolved around larger-than-life leads, films driven by presence, physicality, and sheer forward force rather than layered storytelling. You can almost feel that lineage beneath it. A modern film built on old-school instincts, but what sets Extraction II apart is how clearly it defines itself within that space. It doesn't try to compete on narrative complexity. It doesn't try to reinvent the genre. It doesn't aim for stylistic abstraction. It understands where it stands and stays there. Instead, it focuses on execution, on delivering action that feels immediate, continuous, immersive. The film builds its identity around that sensation of uninterrupted flow, where each moment feeds directly into the next without hesitation. Where some films in the genre prioritize style over clarity, this one prioritizes movement over pause. It doesn't linger on visual flourish for its own sake, it uses movement as the primary tool for engagement. Where others build mythology, this one builds momentum. It focuses less on expanding lore and more on sustaining energy, creating an experience that feels driven rather than layered. And that clarity gives it a distinct position. It knows exactly what it wants to be, and more importantly, what it doesn't. It doesn't stretch itself thin trying to cover multiple tonal directions. It narrows its focus and sharpens it. For some viewers, it stands shoulder to shoulder with the biggest modern action franchises, matching their intensity, even surpassing them in specific moments where execution becomes the defining factor. Those moments where everything aligns, performance, camera, choreography, place it firmly within that upper tier. For others, it sits just below that level, not because it lacks scale, but because it lacks the depth or refinement that defines the very best of the genre. The difference isn't in what it does, it's in what it doesn't fully explore. The absence of deeper narrative layering, of more nuanced character development, becomes more noticeable when placed alongside films that balance both spectacle and substance. And that's the key distinction. Extraction II isn't trying to redefine action cinema, it's trying to deliver it, at full force, without hesitation, without diversion. And in doing so, it carves out its place, not as the most complex, not as the most innovative, but as one of the most committed. A film that understands the genre and chooses to push it forward through execution, not reinvention, through precision rather than experimentation. By the time Extraction II reaches its final moments, it's already looking ahead. There's a forward-facing energy even in its closing beats, as if the film is less concerned with resolution and more focused on continuation. Because this doesn't feel like an ending, it feels like a continuation waiting to happen. The narrative doesn't close, it pauses. It leaves space deliberately for what comes next. The film closes in a way that leaves the door wide open, not just for another mission, but for something bigger, a broader direction, a sense that this story isn't finished yet, and that openness isn't subtle, it's intentional. It's structured into the final moments as a clear signal. You can see the groundwork being laid, new connections introduced, new possibilities hinted at, a world that feels like it's expanding beyond a single operation. The scope begins to stretch beyond immediate objectives, suggesting a larger framework that could support multiple stories rather than a single arc. It's not subtle. The film wants you to know there's more coming. And for many viewers, that's exciting, because the foundation is there. A central character who can carry the franchise, a style that defines its identity, a formula that clearly works for its audience. The core elements are stable, repeatable, and scalable. It's the kind of setup that suggests this could grow into something long-term, something that builds with each installment rather than resets, a progression rather than repetition, a series that evolves even if incrementally, but at the same time, that expansion comes with questions, because growth isn't just about scale, it's about depth. And while the action has evolved, the core weaknesses haven't disappeared. They remain present, carried forward alongside the strengths. The writing still feels thin, the emotional depth still fluctuates, the structure still leans heavily on spectacle. These aren't new issues, they're inherited ones. And as the franchise expands, those issues risk becoming more pronounced if they're not addressed. So the question becomes, can this franchise grow beyond that? Can it keep escalating without repeating itself? Can it deepen its storytelling while maintaining its identity? Can it move forward without relying solely on bigger and louder? Because escalation has limits. At some point, scale alone stops being enough. That's the challenge. Because setting up a sequel is easy, sustaining a franchise is not. It requires evolution, not just continuation, adjustment, not just amplification. Still, there's no denying the intent. Extraction II isn't just continuing a story, it's building a universe around it, expanding its scope, introducing new pathways, suggesting a larger narrative space that extends beyond a single mission. And whether that universe becomes something lasting, or simply more of the same, will depend on what comes next, on whether it chooses to refine its foundation or continue building on it as it is. There's a very specific way Extraction II is built, not just in terms of what happens, but when it happens. The structure isn't accidental, it's strategic, because the film doesn't simply deliver action, it arranges it. It positions its major moments in a way that shapes how the entire experience is perceived, and that arrangement shapes the entire experience. Early on, the film hits hard. It doesn't wait. It doesn't slowly build toward its biggest moment. Instead, it drops one of its most ambitious, most technically impressive sequences right into the first half. a sequence so large or so immersive that it immediately sets the standard. And that's a bold choice, because from that point forward, everything is being measured against it. The film establishes its peak early, creating an immediate benchmark that defines the rest of the experience. Every fight, every chase, every confrontation. The question becomes, can anything match that level again? And that question lingers, shaping how each subsequent sequence is received. And that's where the structure starts to reveal itself. Because while the film continues to deliver action, plenty of it, the placement of those set pieces creates a shift in perception. The early sequence feels like a peak, the middle sustains the energy. But by the time the film reaches its final stretch, the scale feels smaller, not necessarily weaker in execution, but reduced in impact, because the film has already shown you its highest point. The sense of novelty diminishes, not because the action declines, but because the reference point has already been established. And once that peak is established, it's difficult to climb higher. The film maintains its intensity, but it doesn't surpass that initial high, and that creates a subtle imbalance in how the narrative is experienced. This creates an interesting imbalance. The momentum remains, the action continues. But the sense of escalation doesn't follow the traditional path of building toward a climax. Instead, it rises quickly and then stabilizes. It maintains rather than increases, and for some viewers that works. Because the film delivers its best material early, ensuring immediate engagement and sustained excitement throughout. It hooks the audience quickly and keeps them within that energy. But for others, it creates a feeling of diminishing returns, where the final act, no matter how well executed, doesn't carry the same weight as what came before. The sense of culmination feels softer, less defined. It feels less like a climax and more like a continuation. A continuation of the same intensity rather than a peak beyond it. And that's the trade-off. By placing its strongest set piece early, Extraction II guarantees impact. It secures attention. It establishes confidence. But it also changes how everything that follows is experienced. Because once you've reached the peak, everything else becomes a comparison. Each moment is measured against that initial high, whether consciously or not. There's a clear divide running through Extraction II, a line you can feel almost immediately between when the film is in motion and when it stops. And that divide becomes one of the most revealing aspects of how the film functions, because when the action takes over, everything clicks. The film settles into its most natural state, and you can feel the alignment instantly. The energy is sharp, the execution is precise, the film feels alive, not just active, but fully engaged with itself. Every movement has purpose, every sequence pulls you in. There's a rhythm, a flow, a level of control that keeps you fully engaged. It's not just about what's happening, it's about how confidently it's being delivered. The film knows exactly how to operate in these moments, and that certainty translates directly to the audience. There's a sense of cohesion when everything is in motion. The performance, the camera, the choreography, they all move together, reinforcing each other rather than competing for attention. The action becomes more than spectacle, it becomes structure. It's the point where the film feels most complete, most unified, but then the action pauses, and the shift is immediate. The film changes its posture. The momentum slows, and suddenly, what was carrying the experience begins to fade. That underlying engine, the constant forward motion, pulls back, and what's left has to stand on its own. The dialogue takes over, and that's where the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. Because now the film is operating in a different mode, one that requires a different kind of strength, and that strength isn't always there in the same way. Conversations don't always feel natural. There's a stiffness to some exchanges, a sense that lines are being delivered for function rather than expression. Exchanges don't always carry weight. They communicate intent, but not always emotion. Scenes that should deepen the story instead feel like they're holding it back, not because they lack purpose, but because they don't fully realize it. It's not that these moments are unnecessary. They're essential. They're meant to give the film space, to build character, to add meaning between the action. They're the connective tissue that holds everything together. Without them, the film would be nothing but movement, but instead, they often feel like interruptions. Brief pauses that exist only to bridge one sequence to the next, transitional rather than transformative. They move the story forward, but don't always deepen it, and that creates a disconnect. Because the film operates at such a high level during its action, that anything below that standard becomes more noticeable. The difference isn't gradual, it's immediate. You can feel the shift as soon as the film transitions out of motion. You can feel when the film is at its best, and you can feel when it's simply filling time. That contrast becomes part of the viewing experience. It's not hidden, it's exposed. For some viewers, that gap doesn't matter. The action is strong enough to carry everything else. The weaker moments are just part of the rhythm, short breaks before the next surge. They don't detract, they reset. But for others, that contrast becomes the film's biggest weakness. Because it highlights what's missing: depth, consistency, balance. It draws attention to the areas where the film doesn't reach the same level of precision, and instead of the action elevating the entire film, it ends up exposing everything around it. The stronger the peaks, the more visible the valleys. That's the trade-off. When one element reaches a high level, everything else is judged against it, and in Extraction II, that difference is impossible to ignore. In modern action cinema, there's a common problem. Everything is fast, everything is loud, but very little is clear. The emphasis on speed often comes at the cost of coherence. Cuts come too quickly, movement becomes fragmented, and what should feel intense ends up feeling confusing. Extraction II takes a different approach, because here, the action isn't just about speed, it's about clarity. About making sure that no matter how intense things become, the audience never loses their sense of orientation. Even in its most chaotic moments, you can follow what's happening. You understand where the characters are, how they're moving, and what they're reacting to. The film doesn't sacrifice readability for intensity, it integrates the two. The film doesn't lose its sense of space, and that's crucial. Because when the action is this relentless, clarity becomes the difference between immersion and disorientation. It's what allows the audience to stay engaged rather than overwhelmed. The camera doesn't jump around to create intensity. It stays with the movement, it tracks, it follows. It connects actions through motion rather than breaking them apart through rapid cuts. That continuity allows the viewer to experience the action as a progression rather than a series of fragments. You're not piecing the scene together, you're experiencing it as it unfolds. And that immediacy strengthens the connection between viewer and action. That's what makes the choreography work. Every movement leads into the next. Every action has a cause and an effect that you can see, understand, and feel in real time. There's a logic to the movement that remains intact, even as complexity increases, and that readability gives the film a sense of control. Even when everything is escalating, even when the environment is shifting, even when multiple elements are happening at once, you never feel lost. The film maintains a clear internal structure that guides you through each moment. You're always oriented, you know where you are in the sequence, you understand the flow of events, and that orientation becomes essential to maintaining tension, and that makes the impact stronger, because confusion weakens intensity. Clarity strengthens it. When you understand what's happening, you can fully feel its consequences. That's why the action here feels more immediate, more immersive, more engaging, not just because of what's happening, but because of how clearly it's presented. The presentation amplifies the experience. You're not struggling to keep up, you're moving with it, and that alignment between viewer and movement is what gives the film its sense of control. And in a genre where chaos often replaces coherence, that clarity becomes one of Extraction II's most underrated strengths. There's a very clear line that runs through Extraction II, not within the film, but between the people watching it. Because this is one of those movies where your experience depends almost entirely on what you're looking for. If you're an action fan, this is exactly the kind of film you show up for: relentless momentum, large-scale sequences, physical, immersive combat that doesn't hold back. It delivers, and it delivers consistently. The pacing, the choreography, the intensity, it all aligns with what that audience expects and values. You're not waiting for the film to become exciting, it already is. From start to finish, it operates within that heightened space, maintaining engagement through constant motion. But if you're coming in with a different expectation, if you're looking for deeper storytelling, stronger character development, more layered emotional arcs, that's where the experience shifts. Because Extraction II doesn't prioritize those elements in the same way. It touches on them, it introduces them, but it doesn't stay with them. It doesn't allow them to fully develop before moving forward. And that forward motion becomes both its strength and its limitation. And for some viewers, that creates distance. The constant intensity becomes overwhelming rather than engaging. The lack of quieter, more developed moments makes it harder to connect. The film doesn't always provide the space needed for those connections to form. The story feels secondary, something that exists mainly to support the action rather than stand alongside it. It functions as a framework, not a focal point. That's where the divide becomes most visible. One audience sees focus, the other sees limitation. One sees a film that knows exactly what it wants to be. The other sees a film that could have been more, and neither perspective is wrong, because Extraction II doesn't try to satisfy everyone. It commits to a specific experience. It chooses its direction and follows it without compromise. A film built around movement, impact, and sustained intensity. That's the foundation it operates on, and everything else is built to support that core idea. So the question isn't whether it works universally. The question is, does it work for you? Because this isn't a film that adjusts itself to different expectations. It presents a very specific experience, and your response depends on how well you align with it. Because if you're in the right mindset, this is a ride, the kind that pulls you in early and keeps you moving without pause, the kind where the intensity becomes the appeal, where the lack of stillness becomes part of the immersion. If you're not, it can feel like a long one, not because it lacks energy, but because it never steps away from it. And without that variation, the experience can start to feel stretched rather than shaped. If there's one area where Extraction II struggles to keep up with itself, it's here. Because while the action feels sharp, deliberate, and controlled, the dialogue often doesn't carry the same weight. There's a noticeable difference in how much care is placed into physical execution versus verbal expression. Conversations tend to be direct, sometimes too direct. They communicate what needs to be said, but rarely go beyond that. There's little subtext, little layering beneath the surface. Lines are functional, built to move the scene forward rather than deepen it. You hear what's being said, but you don't always feel what's behind it. And that emotional gap becomes more visible the longer the film goes on, and that affects how the characters come across. On the surface, they're clearly defined. You understand their roles, you understand their motivations. You understand what they're supposed to represent within the story. The framework is there. The intent is clear. But beyond that, there isn't always enough space for them to fully develop. The film doesn't linger long enough to explore those layers. It introduces them, acknowledges them, but then moves forward before they can fully take shape. Moments that could build personality, tension, or connection often pass quickly, pushed aside by the film's constant momentum. They appear briefly, then disappear, absorbed back into the forward motion. The dialogue doesn't linger long enough to explore those layers. It delivers information, then moves on, and that creates a limitation. Because characters start to feel shaped by the action around them, rather than shaped by their own voices. Their identity comes more from what they do than from what they say. Their presence is defined through movement rather than expression. For some roles that works. Tyler Rake, for example, doesn't rely heavily on dialogue. His presence is physical. His character is defined through action, restraint, and silence. The lack of verbal depth becomes part of his identity rather than a weakness. But for others, that same minimalism becomes a weakness. Supporting characters, emotional exchanges, key relationships, these are moments where dialogue matters. Where nuance matters, where the writing needs to carry more than just plot progression. And when it doesn't, those moments lose impact. They feel thinner than they should. The intention is there, but the execution doesn't fully support it. There are glimpses of something stronger, brief exchanges, small interactions that hint at deeper connection, but they're not sustained. They don't evolve into something that fully resonates. They appear as possibilities rather than fully realized elements, and that's the core issue. Not that the dialogue is entirely ineffective, but that it rarely elevates the material. It supports the structure, but doesn't expand it. It keeps things moving, but doesn't deepen them. It does its job, but it doesn't add much beyond it. And in a film where everything else is pushed to a higher level, that absence becomes noticeable. The gap between technical execution and narrative expression becomes clearer, because while the action defines the experience, the dialogue was meant to support it, to reinforce it, to give it context and emotional grounding. And here it doesn't always keep up. One of the reasons Extraction II keeps its energy alive is because it doesn't rely on just one kind of action. It understands that repetition would weaken its impact, so it constantly shifts its approach. It adapts, evolves, and reconfigures its sequences to maintain engagement. Just when you think you've settled into a rhythm, the environment changes, the situation evolves, the style of conflict transforms. And that constant variation prevents the film from becoming predictable, even within its consistent intensity. And that variety becomes essential, because this isn't a film built around repetition, it's built around progression. Not just moving forward in story, but moving forward in how that story is delivered visually and physically. The action doesn't stay confined to a single space. It moves from tight, controlled environments to open, chaotic ones. From close-quarters combat to large-scale pursuit. From grounded encounters to sequences that expand in scope and complexity. And each transition forces a recalibration. Each set piece introduces something new, a different layout, a different challenge, a different way for the characters to navigate the situation. The film isn't just escalating, it's recontextualizing the action with each shift, and that keeps the experience from feeling stagnant. You're not watching the same sequence repeated with slight variations. You're watching the film explore different forms of action, each one pushing the momentum forward in its own way. There's also a shift in how those sequences are structured. Some are immediate and intense, short bursts of impact that hit quickly and move on. Others stretch out, long, evolving sequences that build over time, layering movement and tension as they progress. That contrast matters. It creates rhythm within the chaos. It introduces variation without reducing intensity. It allows the film to breathe within its own structure, even as it maintains a high level of energy. It prevents the film from becoming monotonous, even as the intensity remains high. Because intensity alone isn't enough, you need variation in how that intensity is delivered. And because the environments keep changing, the action feels dynamic. The characters have to adapt. The movement has to adjust. The choreography responds to the space rather than existing independently of it. The environment becomes part of the action, not just a backdrop. That's what gives each sequence its own identity. Each one feels distinct, even though they're all built on the same core principle. The film finds ways to reframe that principle again and again. Even though the film is driven by the same core idea, action, it finds ways to present that action differently, again and again. And that repetition with variation becomes one of its strengths. And that variety does something important. It sustains engagement. It keeps the experience active, preventing fatigue from turning into disengagement. Because in a film where the intensity rarely drops, the only way to keep that intensity effective is to keep it evolving. And Extraction II understands that. It doesn't just deliver more action, it delivers different action. And that difference is what keeps it moving. Beneath the action, beneath the constant motion, there's a quieter thread running through Extraction II, and it belongs to Tyler Rake. It's not always at the forefront, but it's always present, shaping how his journey unfolds beneath the surface. Because this isn't just a character returning for another mission. This is someone who wasn't supposed to survive. Pulled back from the edge left with the weight of that survival, and forced to confront something far more difficult than danger. What comes after? There's a sense that Tyler begins this story without direction, not searching for something, but existing. Moving forward because he's still here, not because he knows why. There's a kind of emotional drift to his character at the start, and that's where the arc begins, not with purpose, but with absence of it. It's not about becoming stronger. It's not about proving anything. It's about finding a reason to continue. And that distinction quietly reframes everything about Tyler's journey. Because when a character is no longer driven by validation or redemption, what's left is something more uncertain, something internal. Survival on its own isn't enough. It doesn't answer anything. It just prolongs the question. There's guilt beneath it, not presented directly but implied through how he carries himself. A past that hasn't settled, loss that hasn't faded. A life that feels unfinished in ways that can't be fixed through action. And that's what makes his presence feel different this time. He's not moving with clarity, he's moving with weight. The kind that doesn't go away just because the mission changes. And the film touches on that, not through long speeches or overt explanation, but through presence, through how he carries himself, through how he responds to the people around him, through the distance he keeps, and the moments where that distance starts to break. It's in the hesitation before engagement, in the quiet observation before reaction, in the way he allows others in just slightly before pulling back again. This mission changes that, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually. Because for the first time, it isn't just another job, it's personal. And that personal connection alters his relationship to the objective. It's no longer about execution, it's about protection. The people he's trying to protect, they're not just objectives. They represent something he's been disconnected from: family, responsibility, connection, concepts that exist outside of survival, concepts that require more than endurance. They require presence, involvement, emotional investment. And through them, something shifts, slowly, subtly. It's not a transformation that announces itself, it's one that reveals itself through behavior, through choices, through the way he begins to engage rather than simply react. He begins to move with purpose again, not just to complete the mission, but to protect something that matters. And that difference, however understated, gives his actions a new context. The same movements, the same decisions, but driven by something deeper than necessity. That's where the arc takes shape, from survival to intention, from isolation to involvement, from carrying the past to engaging with the present. It's not a complete resolution, it's a shift in direction, a movement towards something rather than just away from something else. Now, the film doesn't explore this as deeply as it could. The momentum doesn't always allow it. The action often takes priority. The arc exists, but it's compressed, contained within the spaces between sequences rather than fully expanded. But the foundation is there. You can feel it beneath everything else. It informs how he moves through the story. even when it's not explicitly addressed. It gives context to his decisions, even when the film doesn't pause to explain them. And it adds weight to what would otherwise be just another series of confrontations. Because now, it's not just about getting through, it's about why he's still here, and what he chooses to do with that. For all its intensity, all its precision, all its relentless momentum, there's one question that lingers beneath Extraction II. Does it have a heart? Because beyond the action, beyond the spectacle, this is where the film becomes most divisive. Not in how it's made, but in how it's felt. On one side, you can see what it's trying to do. There are moments, small, scattered, but present, where it reaches for something deeper. Moments that step away from the noise just long enough to suggest something more human underneath. A connection between characters, a sense of care beneath the chaos, glimpses of vulnerability that try to ground the experience in something human. These aren't dominant elements, but they're there, woven into the edges of the narrative. You feel it in brief exchanges, in the tension between protection and loss, in the quiet moments that exist between the noise. Moments where the film almost slows down, not completely, but just enough to hint at something beneath the surface. And when those moments land, they add weight. They shift the experience, even if only briefly. They remind you that this isn't just movement, it's people moving through something. People carrying consequences, emotions, histories, but those moments don't always stay long enough. They appear, they register, and then they're overtaken. Because the film is constantly pushing forward, the action takes over, the pace accelerates, and those emotional beats, just as they begin to form, are often left behind, and that creates a gap, a space between intention and execution, between what the film introduces and what it fully explores. For some viewers, that gap doesn't matter. The intensity is enough. The experience is driven by momentum, not reflection. The film doesn't need to slow down, it's not trying to. The emotional undercurrent is a bonus, not a requirement, but for others that absence becomes noticeable. Because without emotional warmth, without time spent building connection, the film can start to feel distant, controlled, mechanical. The precision remains, the execution remains, but the connection weakens. Impressive, but not deeply affecting. It becomes something you watch rather than something you feel, something you admire rather than absorb. That's the tension at the center of it. Between spectacle and substance, between movement and meaning, between what the film does and what it could have done. Extraction II clearly leans towards spectacle. That's where its strength lies, and it doesn't pretend otherwise. But it doesn't completely ignore the other side. It reaches for it, briefly, carefully, just enough to suggest there's something there, even if it never fully settles into it. And in the end, whether the film feels powerful or simply impressive depends on how much that emotional connection matters to you.